Good afternoon, good night, everybody. We are glad to have here Shireen Walton. She will talk about her new book, Aging the Smartphone in Europe and Italy, which is also translated in Italy and in Italian, and is fully downloadable and open source. We will put on our website the link to the download page. And so let me introduce Shireen. You are very welcome. We can wait to hear from you, your presentation. Jillet, would you like to say something?
Just welcome, Shireen, and I'm very interested in the sort of visual sociological aspect that you will bring in the discussion. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much to all of the organisers and colleagues here in Bologna for such a generous invitation. I'm really delighted to be sharing my book with you all today, and after a really wonderful introduction to the context this morning that we had from Daniel, who really kind of put what I'm going to talk about into the larger picture of collaborative research and comparative research that we were very fortunate to be involved in over the last few years of colleagues working together on this project. So what I'm going to do today is kind of give a broad overview of, if you like, zooming into one of these field sites from our project, the Anthropology of Smartphones and Smart Aging project, and give a sense of the ethnographic textures and flavours and sounds from the field in a very multi-vocal ethnography that I was involved with in Milan. That is culminated in this book, Aging with Smartphones in Urban Italy, Care and Community in Milan and Beyond, of which the Italian translation, I'm delighted to say, has just been published, I think, this week. Yesterday we received hard copies, so it's a wonderful opportunity to share that with you all today as part of this conference. So I've got a few slides. Is it possible to...
Share screen. Okay. Allora, dove sei, Paolo? Non ti vedo. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe just touch the screen.
Yeah, you can scroll.
Okay, great. Lovely. So, so begin just to kind of introduce the books themselves, as I mentioned. So we have the English version, originally published 2021 with UCL Press, which is you can see here on your left. And then, as I mentioned, the Italian translation of the book, Smart Aging in Milan, is published with Degli, publisher, just this week. So what I'd like to do is to kind of, we discussed and talked this morning about the sort of the theoretical and macro level overviews and findings of our research collaboration. So as I mentioned, I'd like to kind of zoom in into the Italian context that I was working with and kind of trying to extrapolate some of the key issues and themes that came out of my ethnography. But taking lead from one of the core theoretical points from our collaborative book, The Global Smartphone, the transport of home as a major framework for my own study, which was based in a neighbourhood in Milan, where there are many different communities, migrant communities, and this concept, as we will see, of the transport of home becomes very pertinent, very significant in the context of migration, displacement, and this idea of caring and being with people at a distance and what that feels like and the implications of that, the relationships and care. So just to, before I kind of give an introduction into the field site locality specifically, I'd like to also just mention a little bit about methodology. Like all my colleagues on this project, we're involved in 16 months of ethnographic research in a particular place, while also spending an awful lot of our time, as you would imagine in a project about smartphones, online, on our own devices, on joining WhatsApp groups and different social media groups, and kind of collaborating, but also just being there virtually with our research participants, who in many cases became close friends by the end of this very intense period of field work. And at the end of this kind of brief talk, I'll talk about the ongoing implications of that for staying in touch with research collaborators, particularly then following and during the pandemic, which erupted in Italy just some months after I left, and so there was sort of extraordinary transformation of the place that I came to know, the people's experiences and lives, in this digital context. So I'll touch upon that at the end. So 16 months of what I call in the book urban digital ethnography. So it was on the one hand, it's basically a sort of an amalgamation of more traditional ethnographic research methods of long-term living with communities. So I moved to Milan, I lived in an apartment building, which became a very central part of research on a daily basis, but also the digital aspect as well, spending a lot of time, as I said, online. So participation in community groups was a core element of how I was able to spend time with people, get to know people, particularly that particular area of Milan. There are a lot of NGOs that work with different groups into social inclusivity, refugees and migrant groups, particularly women's groups. So a lot of kind of community activity and participation. But then also what we also heard about this morning, the smartphone in focus as an object of study. So what does that entail? Again, as we heard from Danny talking about going into the phone, quite literally entering into the homes, the smartphone homes of these people's lives, and kind of all the extraordinary things that one would find in the phone, and as a core part of the methodology. So just some photographs here to kind of visualize the level of that, the community participation, making things together, as I said, in these groups again. So just a core kind of methodological point here that, yes, our research was about smartphones, but the point was not just to pinpoint the smartphone out of context or decontextualize it as a methodological focus, but actually it comes in a holistic context of people's lives, like their clothing, like what they do for a living, etc. So it's this kind of broad kind of approach to the methodology. Having said that, going deep into the phone is a key aspect. In this case, for example, I came to learn about how cooking tutorial videos in Arabic were really important for Egyptian women that I came to know in the neighbourhood to access recipes and kind of shared social kind of interactions via these YouTube channels and forums, and which related to aspects of their identity and experience in Milan itself. Again, I'm going to give another example of that in just a moment. Here I'd like to bring out one of the theoretical arguments of the book, which is a concept that I call social availability. So social availability is a concept that I am drawing inspiration here from the architecture of the space that I was very much enmeshed in, these apartment buildings, the sociality of apartment building life, the different socio-economic groups and cultural groups that live in these spaces, and obviously living there, hanging out into the evenings and days with people. I'd like to just briefly introduce this concept from these window shutters, which, as we all know, are very iconic to Italian apartment structures. The persiane building shutters. Now, these shutters, obviously, as we all know, can be opened and closed at various points of the day to protect individuals from heat and light. But also they can be used for privacy and for moments of kind of individuality, and to kind of if you like, have some kind of time inside the home. And so, kind of riffing up a little bit of that from this morning, we were thinking of platforms and various iterations and incarnations of conceptual terminology. This concept of social availability really tries to bring out this idea that people, through their technological devices, particularly smartphones, are all the time modulating their relationship to sociality and to various forms of socialization. And the spectrum of kind of individual private time for hobbies, time for activities and interests, or myself, all the way through to these group chats of sort of 40, 50, 60 people, community groups or family transnational groups that span time and place. So this is constant kind of deep context of social, kind of goings on. And, this is also kind of riffing of this idea of scalable sociality, which is the concept that comes from the Why We Post project, that talks about the way that people modulate the levels of sociality on this kind of scale between very public and private. But here, social availability is trying to articulate how people, as I said, kind of modulate how they are to others. And I found that a very intriguing concept, and the idea, the work of sociologist Richard Sennett here, whose quote I take inspiration from here, that people can only be sociable when they have some protection from each other. And I thought that was a very resonant idea in my Milan field site, where there was kind of constant calls for social participation along various lines, as I said, right away from the individual family through to community, and then also kind of regionally, and then transnationally, all these scales. So social availability is a way into exploring that, and the book details examples of different kinds of available social availability. So a little bit of background into the particular place that my study is based. It's a neighbourhood in Milan, around the north-east of the city, which is a neighbourhood that is quite well known across Italy, but also has been kind of reported on in academic studies, also in policy reporting, or media as well, for various reasons. It's a very diverse community historically, kind of following the Second World War. It's lots of working class factories that are kind of located in this area. There's also, post-World War II migration and various different migratory moments from, as I said, the direct post-war period, also into the 1990s, particularly, and again into the 2000s. And the book kind of in the introduction sets out those different migratory histories and trajectories, right the way through to kind of 2015 and the refugee crisis and the situations that are ensuing from that, also into Italian politics and society and media. So as I said, the Via Padova area is become well known, not always in a good way. This is an area that is also kind of focused on in the right-wing press and in right-wing politicians as a site of, when, because of this very high migrant population, communities is often depicted as a dangerous area, somewhere that is associated with crime and violence and so on. So there's a lot of, as I said, entering into this space is an ethnographer. There's so much unpacking to do. It's a very symbolically and politically loaded area. So trying to really be in this space and understand and let it in, and trying to, through the people that I came very close with, try to uncover it from the inside out. So yeah, just to realise. Now, an important aspect of this is also how the area has been steadily gentrifying over years. So again, you see the presence of a lot of young people kind of occupying spaces in that city, opening up pop-up bars and kind of very kind of vibrant spaces for sort of young socialization to occur. So yes, this is kind of very eclectic mix in this community at the moment. In recent years, it's been termed Nolo, so north of Loreto, which is the main interchange. And so again, a huge part of the ethnography underneath the book is trying to unpack these layers of meaning. What is no, who gets to call it what, the anger, the love, all of the tensions that go into those narratives and those claims to that part of the city. I think at this point, in order to really introduce the neighbourhood, I wanted to just very quickly play a 1 minute soundscape to kind of really situate the neighbourhood and bring it to us here in Bologna today. So I think I'll just do that if it works.
You have some audio?
Yeah.
This. Want to start again?
Yeah.
Touch screen sometimes. Yeah. Okay, it's already. Okay, it's on.
I think it's on, but it's not. Maybe it's loading. Yeah.
To see. And then we get to the screen. Yeah, that's why.
Maybe the audio file
No,
is
no,
still in the USB stick.
I'll try to do it.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Is that?
Okay.
Okay.
No.
Maybe at the end.
Okay.
Okay.
This one.
Oh, there's something.
Maybe.
Yeah, no problem. We'll come back to it. Thank you. So as I said, given the high kind of visibility and sense of this community, there's also, under reporting on it in very negative terms, there's also a lot of pushback and resistance and activism to kind of salvage that, the reputation or the image and the narration of that community in very positive terms. So when I was there, part of my, my research activities is also to kind of participate in for example, anti-racist marches and marches in the city, in the neighbourhood that celebrated diversity and community, and were kind of very much signalling how this community is positioning itself vis-a-vis broader elements of battalion politics and and society. So yeah, just to kind of highlight that that those kind of activities shaped all the ways I came to learn about this neighbourhood. Now, zooming back to the smartphone, which was very much an object in focus, it was really trying to understand the broad ways in which the smartphone, both as a container of social universes, but also as an object featured in people's lives. Again, trying to kind of humbly observe that and kind of and record that, I guess, as the research went on. So for this lady on the left here, placing the smartphone into the headscarf was a very functional, practical, everyday way of doing things, feeding her baby, or like sorting things out in the house, but also by speaking to her friends and relatives, as a kind of automatic hands-free device, if you like, self-fashioned hands-free. For this gentleman, kind of, halfway through riding his bicycle, kind of trying to do it all at once, but also just couldn't wait to not respond to some message that had very much engaged him passionately about an issue, and had to, at this point, then stop before he fell in the canal, presumably. The point is, the sort of ubiquity of the phone as a material object was, again, a very interesting part of how we anthropologically come to understand, where it sits in people's broader repertoires of engaging with things, and what that involves. Now, going back to that point about narratives, and we talked about this morning as well, one of the things I had to kind of contend with, as Diana said, we all actually have a chapter in our collective book about this, was the narratives of the phone. So in the context in Milan, a kind of entry point, as soon as sort of people know that you're carrying out research with smartphones, there's a lot of posturing towards the negative aspects of the phone. It's stealing us of our attention, it's making us more antisocial, it's making us more vain, etc. And often these would loop back into discourses that were coming from elements of strands of media debates. And so, yes, this meme, this image here was something that I received, as part of a WhatsApp group in the area during my research period, of ways that people would articulate how obsessed we are with our phones, in relation to what life was like in the past, where we, reading newspapers and so on. Now you can't walk anywhere without people kind of looking down at the screen. But one of the really kind of powerful aspects that came through in my ethnography was the way that smartphones and digital communications were being utilised and channeled for care practices. Now, this is perhaps not surprising, as I said, in a community where there are many NGOs and social services and kind of institutionalised forms of care, which Milan, of course, also has a huge history, and Lombardy particularly as well. Kind of, in terms of the various, what's come to be known as the Milan model of care, in sociological and social science literature that discusses this. So, in this context, one is perhaps not surprised that the digital then becomes a kind of extenuation of these care practices, and that's what I came to be connected with myself. But even on a more everyday level, I mentioned I was living in an apartment block with speaking with neighbours, and I came to learn about how these networks were actually, in some cases, lifelines for many people who lived alone. And again, part of my research was trying to consult kind of literature and studies, particularly from sociology in Italy, that had studied kind of single-person households in the Italian context, across Italy, different regions. But in Milan, this is a significant social phenomenon, and there's been many studies that highlighted the increasing presence of single-person households in this context. I refer to in the book. And so, knowing a lot of people who lived by themselves in this context, I came to know how dependent they became on, for example, an apartment WhatsApp group that discussed issues of the shared the build and the shared communities of the building, to the maintenance of the building, through to the rubbish collection, through to then morphing from the original functions of for example, an apartment group to more affective avenues for building relationships. So to give you an example, there was a couple that I came to know who were in their 70s, who had lived in this apartment building in Milan for some 40 years. Their grown-up children lived in different cities, and the man was kind of had mobility issues and could not leave the house without significant assistance. And his wife was active in the local school as a retired volunteer. I came to know this couple through various community activities and volunteering myself. When they were first added to the WhatsApp, their apartment building, the two had very different lives. On the one hand, Pietro, the man, kind of was actually the lack of interest then like kind of anger that he was sort of placed into this against his will, encouraged by his wife, because he'd run things the way he's always done for 40 years, and why does he need to join a WhatsApp group to do anything different? Over time, this group, as I said, morphed from the original functions to sharing kind of poetry, or on Labour Day, sharing memes and images, or to Christmas and Easter or birthdays. It became this kind of affective space. But they're also kind of sharing information regarding news and local events that actually, Pietro came to find actually very interesting and useful, and eventually came to be a kind of participant in this group. Not hugely affective or engaged in that sense, but actually, on reflection, didn't mind it and had kind of gone on a journey with it. But it had certainly transformed his own experience of living in that space, in that apartment, again, as someone with mobility issues and a disability. That was something that kind of had affectively and kind of changed his experience of feeling connected to the world in a way that his condition has slowly over time removed him from. So he felt connected to the community through this WhatsApp group. So numerous case stories and examples like this kind of give an ethnographic sense of the way, a qualitative sense of how individuals are modulating their relationship, both to the technology and the narratives about it, but also to that which it connects them to, in this case, community, social groups, etc. So one of the things we've done in our project is we've worked with collaborators such as artists and visual storytellers to kind of visually illustrate some of the key stories and case studies in our book, which goes in line with our wider commitment to making our work accessible, open access, and kind of public facing and in various forms. So this is a story that is visualized from one of the stories from my book, which is based on excuse me, the life experience of one of the research participants. Is kind of an ethno-fiction, if you like, based on the story of Heba, who is from Alexandria in Egypt, who came to live in Milan around 10 years ago with her family. It's a very busy life, in the city. Her husband also works in the city, and they have 2 children. This comic is trying to here kind of give a sense of the various multiple attachments that individuals can maintain through the smartphone. And we talked about this with the transportal home. So it's not like Heather has to decide whether her entire life commitment is in Milan or back in Alexandria, but actually constant kind of back and forth, almost in the same literal minutes between countries, spaces, affective economies, for a term from Sarah Ahmed, is moving Heather around these different spaces, working with people with various migration trajectories, whether they come in various conditions. I haven't got time to talk about them all now, but from refugees kind of who have come more recently using smartphones as lifelines of various sorts, where the home, again, transportal home, takes on a heightened dimension, to people who have a long-term relationship with transnational living, where before the smartphone they just did things differently. We get a lot of diversity reflected in how people live with smartphones in this sense. Just wanted to briefly touch on this background about when we're working this way, in this case, looking at migration, the everyday lives and experiences and stories of migrants. Obviously, one of the important contexts of this is media, but also political discourses. So part of my research that the book talks about is how this has been framed in Italian, across Italian politics and society. I have an example here. This is something that you might have seen yourselves. This is an image that was circulated on social media that was posited as ostensibly showing loads of migrants apparently leaving the port of Libya, all ready to come to Italy. And there's so many people here, and the image here is performing a very particular kind of hyperbolic alarmist work. Now, obviously, after a few hours, it was revealed to be a hoax image, in the sense that this is actually an actual photograph from a Pink Floyd concert from 1989 in Venice. hence all the water and all the people having a good time, and that, you know, obviously then when the actual context resurfaced on the web, you know, then what was interesting, of course, following the life of these images and the discourses, is that how this obviously then becomes hugely polarizing and politicized. So on the one hand, you had a lot of, you know, kind of more educated liberal people kind of bemoaning anyone stupid enough to believe that that was the case. You had other kinds of people who were who had believed it, who kind of still feel angry about migrants coming to Italy, kind of going on. And as always in social media, there's an incredible embattlement that takes place. But you know, this is just to kind of say that whilst the individuals I was very connected to were clearly, you know, certain types of individuals that were, you know, either migrants themselves or were working in social care and community participation activities, my responsibility, I suppose, my intellectual academic responsibility was to really try and uncover the facets of this in broader context and try and tease it out in the book. Yes, so this links to, you know, assumptions about smartphone usage, you know, amongst particularly amongst refugees, again, that were resurfacing at the time, that, you know, people were displaying their shock that refugees had smartphones if they didn't have any economic resources or they lost things, and all of these kinds of narratives that were just very, very prevalent and being constantly repeated and were recirculating. Just to say here that many, you know, stories are, you know, linked to particular individuals that I came to obviously work with, but I also was engaged with particular social and cultural groups and communities as well through my own research trajectory as an anthropologist, of which I'm a Persian speaker, and I came to carry out research with the Hazara community in Milan. Now, the Hazara are an ethnic group originating from Afghanistan, in Afghanistan they're heavily persecuted by groups like the Taliban, and there are several kind of ways that I came to kind of research with the Hazara community in Milan, one of which was through a cultural, a restaurant that doubled up as a kind of cultural and social space, trying to raise awareness about the Hazara community in Italy, but also their struggles back home in Afghanistan. So just to kind of highlight that this research, whilst very kind of multivocal, was also kind of anchored into these, tapped into these very particular social cultural groups and their particular sets of issues. Now, again, when you link that back through the smartphone, whilst we have, you know, the couple I mentioned who live in an apartment block are facing particular sets of issues to do with their age, to do with them, you know, their positionality in society and so on. With the Hazara, you know, things I came to learn deeply about was how smartphones are inculcated in forms of activism and awareness to do with the Hazara, as I said, the persecution and oppression of their community back home, and how the solidarity networks that social media, WhatsApp, Telegram, Viber, all of these groups provided were absolutely fundamental to them in Italy, in their daily lives. They felt connected to, also links to things like remittances and money and so on. So all the various kind of specificities of those individuals is something that also was reflected through the smartphone. So I have a whole section on this question of transnationalism, transnational being and belonging across borders. So I think that kind of, you know, kind of highlights some of the main themes and issues, and I hope you get a sense of what I aspired to do in the research, but also kind of to think about at the multi-scalar level, right the way through from neighbourhood issues through to questions of you know, transnationalism and kind of all the various different stories that we reflected through the book. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you for listening. I'd love to open up this discussion at this point to talk about that.
Thank you very much, Shireen, for your presentation. Meanwhile, we will try to check if the audio file it will work.
Sure.
But I think we have some question about your thought-provoking presentation, and I would like to ask you a question about, I mean, the hoax and fake news about migrants on the digital space is something that has been pretty frequent, not just during the COVID pandemic, but way early before. And do you think that there should be like a connection between like the digital divide on one end and cultural capital on the other end of the people involved within the process? Of course, in the fake news, there is always a misleading will in order to provoke a reaction, and but in your study, you have found some evidence about the idea of digital divide on one end, and on the other end, of course, the cultural capital of the people commenting or believing in the book.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that goes back to your point about the kind of exasperating class divisions, those tensions along those lines. I mean, I think one of the things that we were all studying was the effects of Googling. We were all looking into it. I think I would also reiterate the point made earlier, which is that the individuals that worked with, Italians in this context who, were always mistrustful of certain kinds of information sources, remain so, and would say to me, "Oh, I never Google anything. You can't trust the rubbish you get on the internet. I don't do it at all." But not always necessarily true, but again, shrouded in a kind of performative, anti-popular channels kind of, very performative rejection of that. But actually, there were subtle nuances in actually what they would do in practice. And often, I'm just thinking of a particular person and their partner had told me actually it's not true, kind of stuff actually do that. So, going back to that methodology of what people say and then what people do. So my point in answer to your question is I found a lot of continuity in people's, whether it's their sort of socio-economic context and circumstances, or their posturing, or the performativity, with then how they situate themselves to those kinds of practices. But a lot of people that I came to work with didn't see any problem with Googling whatsoever. Some of the women that I worked with would say, "God, we're so blessed to have such access to information, that as long as I have my Wi-Fi is working, whatever, it's such a blessing to be connected." So and they still have their own various ways of also some traditional ways, or through social networks, of verifying or qualifying health practices or traditional medicine practices or whatever. There was a whole constellation going on. So it's not like there was one authority, it was a real constellation. But there was a lot, I just found a lot of continuity with people's attitudes towards these things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I was asking, I was thinking about asking something, but actually you just answered it. It's such a complete answer about the performativity of people answering to questions or to interviews, dealing with the smartphone that also has many stereotypes around it, about the use of it and how people see you while you're on the smartphone. They already know what you're doing with your smartphone, etc. Yeah. So about the contradictory, maybe, as you were saying that before, the answer was negative, and then actually it wasn't. So is it like you got skilled to interact with that kind of answer to the question? Like the first time you kind of trusted more the initial answer, and then you understood that you had to go a bit more, finding a more sincere answer that usually was like, yes, very easy.
Yeah, definitely. I think what we were talking about is a particular type of reaction. But, you know, the beauty of doing such a diverse kind of, I guess, study is that was not always the case, you know. So, you know, when I talked to the Hazara research participants, they didn't see the smartphone as the devil or anything like that. I mean, it was or stealing. I mean, they saw it as an absolute lifeline for you know, the social justice, the human rights issues that they were connected with, also on a more, you know, everyday level. How they speak to their family, who are scattered across Northern Europe, and actually many of them came as refugees under, you know, in the last 10 years. So, you know, it depends, you know, who you are, but the ethnographer has to clearly, obviously, kind of go into any research environment prepared for anything, really, because we just don't know where that positivity or that community is going to come from. And it relates just to getting to know the people, and that's why the trick is not to instrumentalize the smartphone. So I would not go to people and sort of say, okay, hi, I'm Shireen, I'd like to talk about smartphones, do that. There's a long process of building trust and relationships and getting to know why some people then feel like that about their phone, because it makes sense in terms of the repertoire of their other practices. So yeah.
Okay. Sorry for stop sharing your screen, but Jillet has a question on.
Oh, great.
Works. Yeah. Found it. Okay, Jillet, can you hear us? You can.
Yes. Much ado about nothing. Okay, Shireen, I thought that the way in which you wrote the book, that you want to talk about smart aging, but you also want it to be an intergenerational story. That was really fascinating for me because I recollect when I first visited Italy, that was around in 2017, the perception of the elderly amongst the young, this really, stood out for me in my first few interactions, that the young would always point out to the elderly as being associated with TV viewing, and really, a particular type of TV viewing in Italy, right? So as you were speaking, and also in the context of the question that Laura asked, in the larger book as well, there is a discussion of how the smartphone, the elderly perceive that it makes them feel younger. Did they perceive that there was this association between them and the TV, and was the smartphone a kind of foil for them for that also?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I love that question because I like to talk about like genealogies of things and media histories. That's something I really think is such an interesting thing to think about, and always thinking about it. So yes, the television through to the smartphone. So it boils down to, I guess, it's the narration thing again. It's how people view themselves in relation to that particular technology and what that technology is shrouded in, often in, as we know, kind of quite moralizing societal discourses. So, in the 50s and 60s, when families, certain kind of families were able to have television in their homes, and this was then at once an extraordinary, positive thing, but also then became the death of kind of family dinner times, and all of that kind of discourses slowly over time took hold and solidified those arguments. And what we do in the global book is try and trace some of those histories in the fields light. So yes, I think in terms of the older population that I worked with in Milan, they would feel younger in that sense. I mean, sort of, in the sense we're talking now, with regards to how adept they were at using smartphones. And obviously we can't detach that from the point made earlier, which is that this is supposed to be a young person technology. And so the sort of subtitle of our book is Beyond the Use of Technology, for that very reason.
So I think in the island field site in Italy, there is a case that we sort of argue and talk about in these books about how these practices are making people affectively feel younger, because that very association, right, is like it's like having a sort of certain type of cool jeans or new clothes. Like if everyone young is doing it, we're doing it too, but we also are hugely good at it, dependent on it, then it takes its toll, because that image doesn't fit in with the image of aging and frailty that we're sold so much.
The only thing I'd add to that is actually this then has a consequential effect on understanding the ecology of platforms, because if you know what's happened in the last 10 years, Facebook was young, right? It was never going to be used, and actually I got into a lot of trouble when I first said it's no good for young people. So then older people got it. So what do young people do? They go off Facebook, they go onto Instagram. Older people go on Instagram. Young people observe that. What do young people do? They go on TikTok. I'm just come back from Trinidad, where older people are going on TikTok. So one of the key points is that technological studies will tend to focus on the affordance of a platform. Right? People use TikTok because of what TikTok is. People use Instagram. But actually, this has nothing to do with the affordance of the platform. It's to do with intergenerational dynamics. As soon as older people come of it, young people need to leave it, they're going to find a young person's space. And that is one of the most important processes that generates platform change. And the problem is that people keep focusing on the platforms when actually that is, it's actually the platforms are being utilized within intergenerational dynamics. And already after 10 years, this is so key.
Yeah, and about what you just said, I'm just thinking about the fact that the use of digital platform in general as kind of also trickle-down effect, or the same way of adoption of fashion, like the early adopter, the cash cow, and then of course the decrease and so on and so forth. I think that is like any product in the world or every service in the world is taking the same process of adoption and dismiss of the use of that. But then also there is another issue to reflect on, like what you said about Facebook and Instagram is happening also in Italy, and it's kind of a global trend, but by some extent, like there is very little difference between being on Facebook and on Instagram. I'm talking about the pessimistic end of the ownership of the data, since both companies are owned by Meta and so on and so forth, So there are some kind of complex element of reflection, especially in the context in which where are we behaving? I mean, in which domain or in which private domain are we behaving? Is that the Zuckerberg kingdom, or is another,
I think again it shows a problem with focusing on corporations. The change from Facebook to Instagram does not involve the change of corporations. The change from Instagram to TikTok is a totally different situation. People couldn't care less about corporations on the whole. The dynamic is what matters. I cannot see any difference between a shift from Facebook to Instagram and from Instagram to TikTok. TikTok is Douyin, it's a Chinese. I have a PhD student who's an intern in the company that produces TikTok. And that's a completely different way. Who cares? And that is the problem. I respect the platform work that is done on corporations, but you've got to understand that is not always positive. That actually there are other things going on in that, and that we have to respect the evidence for what actually creates change. And in this case, corporations have nothing to do. Otherwise, why would we stick to it?
Yeah, that's.
May I just add a question here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Danny, actually, I remember reading, I think it was in the How the World Changed Social Media series, this, a discussion about surveillance and are people worried about how their data is being used. And I remember that you mentioned that, there was a difference between whether people perceive that they are being watched by the state or whether they're being watched by by corporations. But I think the other thing that perhaps both of you have touched upon in your book is surveillance within the family and within the larger network. Because with my student Brian, who has joined us here today, we actually look at, we've been getting some of this data also from our field site in India. We've been looking at digital money and how people often share a variety of devices, accounts, etc. And the sense that they are being watched and controlled. So in that sense, this balance between care and surveillance is a very real one that we see here as well. If you could, just elaborate on that.
I mean, I think you've gone even behind the mechanism we were talking about. Why does one generation leave the platform and go onto another platform? And you're absolutely right that when we are doing our field work, people are very concerned with surveillance, but far more concerned with surveillance from their mother than their surveillance by corporations. Far more. It's what your mother sees that you care about, and that's why you have to move. I mean, what would you?
Yeah, I mean, we have a kind of a chapter or a sub-chapter called the fine line between care and surveillance that we all found in all of our 10 field sites is that, and it says, people do care about the intimate surveillance in the house, in the smartphone home metaphor we're working with. And, yes, so no, certainly, I think, talking to people about surveillance capitalism, well, it doesn't often, in my experience, this ethnography come from people, but in the Italian context as well, there was a lot of talk about privacy. In Italy particularly, there's a lot of very public discussion about privacy laws, and I think that comes into the media reporting quite a lot. So there's a lot of that awareness and discussion, and many people would have different degrees of caring and thinking about that. But at the ethnographic everyday level, those window shutters for me were the perfect metaphor. The everyday surveillance.
That's great.
Hello.
Hi, Brian.
Yeah. Hi. So hello everyone, and I am doing like a old school raising my hand because I could not found the hand raising in the Zoom. Sorry for that. And hello ma'am. My name is Brian. So for my PhD, I have focused on community dwelling elderly and in the neighborhood especially, and where I also observed the use of digital technologies. And ma'am, I have recently read your book, which I really like the way you have put your argument, and that will also help me to enhance my own argument. But ma'am, I have two observations. First is that when you're talking about social availability, you have talked about from the surveillance perspective. But apart from surveillance, if there are any other aspects where you want to touch upon, like suppose in my field, I observe that often in the neighborhood, elderly does not want to interact with with some specific neighbors, and in the neighborhood, there's a hostile situation will exist. So whether the social availability concept can be used in order to avoid some neighbors or in order to avoid some interaction with the neighbors, but on the other hand, they have to also maintain the good neighbors.
Thank you. That's a really great question, because I can speak quite a lot about that, because as I said, that apartment building was one of the central, I would call it the heart of my ethnography. I lived in it for a long time myself, and I got to really understand how people, I mean, in some cases people would maybe time their exiting so that they didn't necessarily have to have a conversation with particular other individuals. There was one woman, an older woman, that always cleaned and dusted her communal part of the patio of the balcony. We were living in a casa in Jillet, and very communal, collective, kind of old, kind of classic apartment blocks. And she would always be dusting and cleaning outside as a way of trying to understand who is around, what is going on, who's leaving the building. So this was surveillance. And I really kind of got to understand that. And there were, others who were just didn't necessarily want to explain the entire where they're going, who they're seeing, and so we're tying their entrance and exits not to maybe necessarily have a kind of discussion always, and trying to be polite about it, right? So that discretion is a very sensitive thing I got to tease out and engage in myself, which was really fascinating. I can talk about another time, another conversation, but the ethnographic discretion is something again that it taps into social availability. And I write a little bit about that in the book, which is about when am I available and unavailable as a researcher into such an embedded long-term commitment. It is very, very intense, obviously, emotionally, and all the rest of it. So, all these hundreds of groups, not hundreds, but many WhatsApp groups that one joins as well. And when do you leave? The etiquette of leaving. In many cases, I haven't left. I'm still there, but not. So, yeah, massive methodological implications and ethical ones too.
We have also,
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
We have also another question from Yoshi. Am I right? Did I spell your name correctly?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you, Pierre. First of all, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And I have been throughout the day trying to connect the dots across the presentations. I'm just thinking about, so we know that platforms themselves or these corporations are already embedded in certain kind of a socio-economic context. Now, this context can be at a global level, if somebody is studying at a very macro scale, or going at a very local scale, right? But one thing that we already know from decades down literature, anthropology, and sociology, that there are existing hierarchies that's there, which is based on gender, which is based on class, race. In India, it's also caste. What I'm trying to understand from our ethnography, how do we study these kind of hierarchies being reproduced in these kind of digital spaces, or are they being actually obliviated or reduced in this digital space in that sense? So that's my question. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question. Just to give one example from India. So in the previous series, we had this by Shireen Walton, which is based, and what he did was, when we started the project, he was working in, as you know, near Chennai is a big IT sector, right, with thousands of people working professionally in the IT industry. But these are being created in places that were rural. So right next to them, there are villages. And the interest he had when we started the project was to compare the social media use by the IT professionals and the social media use in the villages that are around there. But if you go to the end of his book, he finds that actually, in many respects, the exact things you're talking about, caste, gender, the extent to which actually, for example, women's use of social media was surveyed by male relatives, then in many ways, he really didn't get the differences between the IT professionals and the villages he expected. And the reason for that is precisely because of continuities around issues of caste and gender, which are so deep within Indian sociality that actually they manage to even transcend what if you are there, looks like an incredible distinction between these very modern, glitzy IT places, and next to it are villagers who are planting rice. So I think that the point about the study is it allows the option. It is an empirical study, that is to say, he was very open to the expectation that this would be about a difference, one set of differences between the IT professional and the villagers, but he comes up with a different result. And I think that's why the book is good, and that's why the book is important, because you just try and see, given these different kind of parameters. Which of the parameters are going to remain significant when it comes to the study of the effect of digitalization? So I think that was certainly an interesting study within the Indian context.
Thank you.
Okay, Jillet, you just forgot your hand raised, or you have another question?
No, I have another question. I actually wanted to go back to the point that Brian had brought up about social availability. So I think I'm wondering, Shireen, because you've done this sort of intergenerational analysis, whether social availability, I mean, so basically one of your arguments is that the smartphone is, the elderly use smartphones in order to carve out that kind of social availability for themselves, where they have some access and discretion as to who gets what chunk of their time. Do you think this is a concept that's particularly applicable to the elderly? Because in one sense, there's also, a lot of people may have this perception that when you're old, your time is much more fluid, particularly in the context of post-retirement lives. So anyone may feel like, it's okay for me to go and make this claim on the time of someone who's much older, particularly because, you may be retired, or I'm just wondering whether it's equally applicable to other generations as well.
Thank you. That's a great question, because it probes this concept even deeper, and I appreciate that. Thinking about social availability as as I'm proposing it, and in relation to the Milan research, is that on the one hand you've got different axes here, the way I've envisaged it. So on the one hand, it's about time. So as you say, it's about, okay, if you're a retired Italian, middle class woman who is living in Milan, and I have enough money and time, then I might engage with local volunteering activities, because actually it gives me incredible satisfaction. I have community, and I'm doing stuff, and I give my time, etc. So that, I bring up those particular variants of because that is many case studies of individuals work exactly like that. But there's also so there's time, but there's also another axis of care, which is another thing I work with. So we're talking about older populations. It's like, who do I want to, how much care activity is able to take place within, for example, again, many women in their 50s and 60s caring upwards to aging mothers who live by themselves and would not touch smartphones. So when I talk about the smartphone, I'm really talking about populations between, in 50s, 60s, early 70s. Many of my research participants of those ages, older parents, did not have these technologies. So I just wanted to make that clear. So so to the care, it's like, okay, I was with one woman who was in tears because her mother had a fall, and she was living by herself, but she just would not accept being bought a smartphone. She hated the thing, I'd reject, and this would make my friends so upset. And it would make her life really difficult, because she had to drive it to whatever it is, to Piacenza, every weekend to go and do lots of chores and do the round trip to Milan. Had a full-time job as well, but she used to say, God, how my life might be different if my mother had a smartphone. So these really, what we've been talking about, how it makes everyone's social life buzzing and stuff, but the care angle is a really often fraught with tensions and rejections and difficulties. Another angle of the social availability that I play with in the book.
If I may offer a case from our own field, we came across an elderly woman who used to live by herself, and with the pandemic, she shifted and she started living with her daughter, son-in-law, and 2 children in a flat. And we had, it was a very interesting conversation. We were, of course, trying to follow up how they were dealing with the pandemic. And one of the things she spoke about was exactly this aspect of social availability, but from the perspective of the amount of care work she does in that family. So for instance, this was a woman, because she lived by herself, she had her own routines, earlier. So this is my time for TV watching, this is my time for doing this, that. But once she entered this family, it was assumed that she's going to be available for the grandchildren, nonna sempre nonna, right? So any time of the day. So the only respite this poor woman would get was, so she said, I want to watch Netflix and all those things, but the TV is always with the grandchildren. So it's my smartphone that I use, so it's some balance. I mean, that was her way of getting balance back in her life.
Thank you, Jillet. I mean, one thing I just wanted to add to that was, our books are very much, yes, aging with smartphones, but we're also obviously getting to know a huge diverse range of people without smartphones, very much featured in our studies as well, or they'd be different types of technologies, and we can go into detail about that, but in many cases, as I said, especially during the pandemic, I was really, my heart was bleeding for all these people that I knew, and I knew that they couldn't see their elderly parents, and they wanted for so long to get these smartphones, then the COVID happened. But obviously there's a lot of strong ideas about what technologies people feel comfortable with. So in the case of this older woman who did not want smartphones, the reason for that was because, in her words, the house phone gave her everything she wanted, and all she really wanted was to be in touch with her adult children every day. So her sons would phone every day at a particular exact time, and the house phone was a familiar object that she's had for decades, and it was almost a very close relationship she had. The smartphone would completely disrupt and unsettle that for her. So it's the agency first.
Just to add something about the grandparenting, because that's actually a major feature in the work that we do. And one of the issues about grandparenting is it can be understood in two ways. It can be understood as kinship, in which case it's understood as an obligation, or it can be understood as something that you choose to do to help your children and because of your love for your grandchildren. And that's an important tension in its own right. So where I was working in Ireland, the generation of grandparents were very concerned that they were not taken for granted as grandparents. They were not doing it as kinship obligation. They were doing it as an expression of love for their care for their children and grandchildren. And that way, they knew if you do it that way, if you're not taken for granted, it's also appreciated. Or thank you for doing it. If it's done simply because that's what grandparents do, it's not particularly appreciated. So this section about, if you like, availability and how actually one makes oneself available and the spirit in which that's given is actually crucial to modern grandparents in that sense, because it can represent completely different things depending on those intergenerational relations.
How much do you think that's connected to this concept of smart aging, though? I mean, because with smart aging or successful aging, there's also this expectation that you are going to carve out your identity, and age does not matter there, right? And perhaps some of that discourse also sees this carving out of identity as being separate from, this is then that very old debate of, your conventional or obligatory roles versus what you can carve out for yourself.
I mean, I think I see it more as a much more general sociological change between the dominant idioms of kinship and friendship, whether we do things out of, as I say, obligation, or whether we do things out of freedom. But you're right, we also do see it there in terms of the ability of older people to carve, to create, to carve out time, to carve out social relations. I mean, one of the subtitles of Art of Islands is How Life Becomes Craft, in which the thing you are crafting is life itself. And the degree to which retired people are starting to focus on the possibilities of crafting. And then, because the smartphone becomes, as it were, a smart emulation of that. What they're not doing, however, just going back to your precise question, is they don't see this in terms of successful age. Just like Sarah Lamb's kind of critique of this notion of successful aging. They're not trying to conform to a government idea or a superior idea. This is now successful aging as opposed to unsuccessful aging. They reject that kind of desire. I think it has much to do with other things about how relationships should be expressed. And I think it has, and in a sense, the changing meaning of love. I would say it's probably more important.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel and Shireen. Antonella has a question.
Thank you a lot for your presentation and for this discussion. It was open to a lot of ways of reflection. So thank you. And so I had many questions in my mind, but going back to social networks, social media topic, and we discussed before about this generational gap over one, I don't know, it is better to call it. And working with digital ethnography on social media, I have this question. I see that it is people do different things on different social media. So it is right. I completely agree with you. Young people move from one to another, and old people follow them one to another. But it is also right that when we do research, we use different tools, and sometimes it is very difficult to choose the right tools in analyzing different platforms. For example, from Facebook to TikTok, strategies are so different that you have to think every time, what can I do in this way? Or Instagram, is it better to use an hashtag or a period of time? And so it is a big question for me, because sometimes I feel frustrated in front of my research. So what do you think about this?
I mean, funny enough, I think it's probably less true for us because of our ethnographic base. Because ultimately, I mean, the point you're making is that, you know, you look at TikTok and you see the algorithm works in a particular way, and then you have to think in terms of how it circulates. But I think the way we work, it doesn't. It's always contextual. Our question is not what is the different mechanics of TikTok and the different mechanics of Instagram. It is how does it relate to grandparent? How does it relate to you know, social availability, etc. And that's the point. We just looked at that intergenerational dynamic. The technological differences fade away because actually what you're understanding is intergenerational dynamics. So I think that the solution for us is always to look at the consequences.
Okay.
What is this actually? What is the area of social life you're interested in? And research, what does it do in terms of that area of social life? Religion, it can be grandparent, it can be whatever you like, but we are seeing it contextually. And that, in a sense, the methodology, and in an odd way, our methodology doesn't change at all. Never has. What we do is absolutely classic. It was done 100 years ago the same way. But we just, we contextualize. So it depends on which way, if you're going from above, you have to change every time. If you're going from below, you don't.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, I suppose, you know, if you mentioned at the individual level, doing in-depth kind of, I guess, qualitative interview, you know, stories with people, and you get to this topic of smart brains and you're going through it, and there are really, obviously, really individual examples of, oh, I might struggle with my expression on this platform or this platform, but you know, we take the individual case study, I suppose, and then like link it up into the broader context of that person's day or their life, what else they're doing, and yeah, it's a really interesting scaling process that takes into account the platform logics, but in relation to the multi-scalar focus as well. So yeah.
I mean, the notion we have of scalable sociality helps because what it means, it's an old structure idea. It means these platforms also relate to each other. So a new entry changes the old entry. And a holistic view looks structured. It looks not at the platform, but it looks at plurality of, if you like, an ecosystem of platforms and how each one has meaning in relation to the other. So scalable sociality was simply, oh, this one is a more private one, this one is a more public one, this one is more family, this one is more community. because they create niches and they.
What's interesting about the person-centered approach is that it's obviously relational to the platform, so it's not like these things are separate. It's like how is the person affecting and being affected by the space of the platform. But one of the concepts we have in the global book is called the screen ecology, for example, where we look at the ecology of these environments in one person's life. So how, say a 70-year-old man with a particular disability, in an apartment building who never leaves the house, uses the PC, which is the case of my book, uses his PC to read the news every morning at the same time, drinking his coffee, having a cigarette, and then uses his smartphone tied around his neck by his wife knitted him a case so he always had it like an emergency button in case he falls, and then he uses his Padlet, his Padlet device to kind of go on Wikipedia and search things, so because it relates to his eyesight and his glasses and what he can see. So these are very obviously humane and qualitative insights, but it's just to show that that's how we follow the life of these devices and these platforms through the life of an individual in a day, and then link that up to things like etiquettes on different platforms and how people are being excluded or, in some cases abused on those platforms, or left out and not even joined or forcibly joined, like that gentleman I was talking about. So yeah, just wanted to riff on that the person's approach.
Yeah, I think Jillet has one more question. Am I right?
More of an observation. So, when it comes to this algorithmic logic, I'm wondering, for instance, in your own field sites and, in the multiple field sites, was there any discussion of, this is viral now, particularly amongst people who are older? I'll give an example. I mean, for instance, what we think of as socialities, I come from a land of very dangerous socialities, right? And for instance, as part of my PhD research, I actually studied a caste group online. And these were, although they were just on Facebook, and a majority of the people on that caste group were actually elderly males. So they were very interested in counting so their presence on Facebook was very much tuned to, okay, passing on news linking kinship and caste, but also I think, other kinds of caste and religious mobilizations as well. So I'm wondering if, and this is many years ago, but I'm wondering what the contemporary context is, because I'm assuming at least some of the people you spoke to might be expanding into, sort of multiple social media sites or even apps. And whether they are sort of cognizant of this concept of something being viral. So the algorithmic side and what people do are, of course, connected. I'm just trying to see if that link was visible for you.
Yeah, I suppose not so much in the sense that the people that I was working with, the broader collectives they would be linked into would be, for example, there were loads of, so there was people would connect to cultural kind of groupings, for example, Sicilians in Milan, or Sicilians in that part of Milan would be a massive WhatsApp group, right? Or, these Hazara networks I was talking about that were transnational groups that linked Hazara people from all over the world back to Afghanistan. So, individuals might link in back to cultural groups on WhatsApp. Also, the same person that's member of a group linking to that kind of identity can also obviously be a member of a gardening group or a horticultural group. So obviously the extraordinary coexistence of these things affectively and the contradictions and all of it is part of what makes up this very intense environment of the smartphone, to say the least. I'm not sure about this question of virality. I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, what you mean by that. I would say that people were aware of different scales of
being connected, right, as I said, right from community and family through to tapping into things that brought them into the deep politics and issues of, say, Indonesia, to take another research participant's case study. I'm not sure about sort of the more, do you think the sort of more public nature of things?
Sorry to interrupt you, but for instance, I mean, if you even stick with the Hazara community, you know, this idea, because as a community, there are also interconnections with larger kinship networks within the community itself, right? So part of that political activism is also going to tap into those networks. You know, because people who use smartphones will, I'm wondering if there's a heightened sense of, you know, we have to make this trend now, or this has to go viral, you know, whether it is activism or other forms of identity.
Definitely. Thank you. And linking that back to the example helped me understand, the point. But absolutely. So as I said, the fact that there was that instant access to an online following or community, particularly on Twitter, right, where it was a very public platform, which is about the different logics, was fundamental to, you know, many of the Hazara activists that I worked with. Would, you know, Twitter would just be there visibly, you know, things would be ready to share because they were circulating news about, you know, bombs going off or things happening in real time or live streaming videos. So absolutely, the virality was very palpable and very present. But then something much more tender, like a group on Telegram sharing the birth of someone's child, would be happening all at the same time. So that incredible scaling is something that I encountered.
Just to add another complication, these don't necessarily follow established networks. I mean, the most recent work I've been engaged in is we've been working with anti-vaccination movements. I've been looking at this in the Trinidad context. And these are not, they split network after network. They're not actually resonant with particular ethnic differences. They're not necessarily, they've generated their own, often very antagonistic differences, simply whether you're pro-vaccination or anti-vaccination. And I mean, I think we have gained an understanding of what lies behind it in terms of certain cultural ideas about audience, etc. But I can't simply reduce it, as it were, to established networks. There's all sorts of interesting things going on in anti-vax that we're working with, which actually generated around the controversy around vaccination itself.
Okay. So there are any more questions, reflection, comment, whatever?
I was just thinking about the generational thinking about young people moving from one platform to another and older people following them, and also the witnessing of this phenomena through language with some new words that just reflects this new reality of all the people that tries to imitate, for example, like boomer and stuff like that. I mean, that's like the...
Well, the OK boomer meme was itself a commentary.
Yeah, exactly.
It was making fun.
Yes.
Exactly, it's the one.
Yes,
it makes it an interesting meme itself. Absolutely right.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, I think ultimately the intergenerational is obviously going to be, I mean, when I first came to learn about, you know, as we're devising this project and started to work on it, it seemed like a natural combination to smartphones and aging. You know, it's so steeped in intergenerational is like a massive framework for that, and every generation seems to feel like it has its technology or it has its language. And yeah, this constant kind of vying back and forth continues as we evolve through different digital technologies. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have come to an end. Thank you very much, Shireen. Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm glad that you joined our project, and we appreciate both your contribution. Thank you for all the attenders, and hi Jillet, thank you from your end of the world. Thanks
For having us.
We will back tomorrow morning with the section on digital money at the same Zoom link. So see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.